While it might strike some as odd, I do respect Trump supporters who claim that Biden won through fraud. I'm taking them seriously, the same way I would take a claim by a professional colleague seriously in a philosophical dispute. I'm also assuming that they are being serious themselves. This respect manifests in two ways. First, I make an assumption of honesty on part of the Trump supporters. That is, I assume that they believe their claims and are not knowingly making false claims for nefarious purposes, such as trying to steal the election. Because there is currently no evidence for their claims of widespread voter fraud, I believe that Trump supporters who make these claims are mistaken. But this is vastly different from claiming that they are lying. While it might not seem like an important distinction, the difference between honest error, making a mistake, and lying is very significant. Honest error, or an honest mistake, occurs when a person believes a claim that is false, but they think it is true, and they put in the work to check their belief. A person is lying, of course, when they knowingly make false claims with the intent to deceive. Now, if Trump supporters believe that widespread voter fraud is real, then they would presumably either have evidence for their belief, or they would support efforts to find credible evidence. After all, if they believe they are right, they should be confident of inquiries into their claims. The evidence should be there for all to see. As discussed in my previous video, Trump supporters tend to regard all the major news sources, with the exception of Fox, although Fox apparently is getting trusted less, and various academic institutions, etc., as mere purveyors of fake news and lies. As such, we cannot undertake our search for evidence in such places, although if these sources did find evidence of fraud by Biden, Trump's supporters might find them credible in this one instance. But as I noted in my previous video, voter and election fraud are crimes, typically felonies. As such, if the Democrats perpetrated widespread voter or election fraud, then there should be evidence, and this should be turned over to law enforcement. To use an analogy, if it were claimed that there is a group involved in a nationwide illegal money laundering scheme, then there should be evidence for this alleged crime, and the police should be informed. If there is credible evidence, law enforcement would presumably find it, and there would be documentation in the form of police reports, court transcripts, and the like. This should also hold true of crimes of voter or election fraud. We should see the evidence. Now, if Trump supporters do not believe what they're saying, then they would have no evidence to support their lies and would have no interest in looking for evidence because it doesn't exist. If they do believe what they're saying, then they should be able to provide evidence and should support the search for objective evidence. This seems to be a reasonable test of honesty. The honest believer wants to believe the truth and has no fear to follow the evidence to its conclusion. The liar has no evidence and attempts to distract others from the search for truth. To use another analogy, if Ted tells me that his neighbor Sam, whom he dislikes, is kidnapping people, and he is being honest, then I would expect him to provide evidence of this, and also I would certainly expect him to take evidence to the police. And if he was unwilling to do so, if I believed him, I would definitely go to the police, because kidnapping is a crime, and we certainly don't want Ted to get away with, Sam to get away with this kidnapping. Now, if Ted has no evidence, and I say, what is the evidence for this? You claim that, Sam is kidnapping these people, and then he just says, he's doing it, he's kidnapping people. And I say, well, are you going to go to the police, and get them involved? And he says, no, I'm not going to do that. Then I might suspect that Ted is lying about Sam. If he was seriously concerned about kidnapping and had actual evidence, he would presumably go to law enforcement, because that's what you do when you think people are committing serious crimes and you've got evidence. Now, if he was just trying to make trouble for Sam or, talk, smack about Sam, I would expect that he would make unsupported claims, but never go to the police, because they would tend to look for evidence. And so if he has no actual evidence of this and is just, lying about Sam, then pretty clearly he's not going to go to the police, unless he thinks that they'll get in on it with him. So that's my first assumption, an assumption of honesty, that Trump supporters believe what they're saying. And if they do, they should certainly support efforts to find that evidence, because if it is occurring, there will be evidence, and then law enforcement should be involved. If they're not telling the truth, of course, they would have no interest in pursuing the matter because they would know there is nothing to pursue. My second assumption is this. I make the assumption of moral motivation. This is the assumption that Trump supporters are sincere when they say they love democracy and are motivated only by a desire to have an honest and fair election. That's to say, I accept their claims that they're patriots who believe in America, who believe in democracy, who believe in fair elections. I take those seriously. Now, the main alternative is, of course, that these claims are lies. They don't really care about how Trump wins as long as he just wins. That is, they don't have a laudable motivation beyond wanting their guy to hold on to power. Now, given the assumption that I'm making of moral motivation, that Trump supporters want democracy, they want fair elections, that they want what is good and right, then the Trump supporters would be morally committed to what they claim to believe in, namely a fair and honest election in which the candidate who receives the majority of the legitimate votes wins the state in question. This moral view does, however, obviously commit a person to opposing voter and election fraud. This sort of fraud would undermine democracy and make an election illegitimate to the degree that this fraud occurred. So, I definitely agree with Trump supporters on this point. Election fraud would be bad and would undermine the credibility of an election. So I also oppose voter and election fraud like they do, because such fraud would be an attack on a foundation of democracy and would be an attempt to rob citizens of their right to choose, which is a fundamental moral and political right. Now, this view also that election, fraud is bad, also commits a person to opposing false claims about voter or election fraud. Why? Well, false claims about voter or election fraud, saying that it's occurring when it's not, can obviously damage the perceived legitimacy of an election. They can also be used, somewhat ironically, to commit a form of election fraud in which legitimate votes are rejected due to false claims that they are fraudulent. So if Trump supporters have a sincere moral commitment to democracy and honest elections, and given that they profess to be patriots, and I have no reason to doubt them, then they should join me in vehemently opposing false claims of voter or election fraud, because these are dangerous to the democracy and honest elections that we both purport to love. Now, if Trump supporters, when pressed on this, show little or no concern about ensuring that claims of fraud are accurately assessed, investigated, and their truth or falsity determined, then it would be reasonable to infer that they don't really care about the integrity of elections. Rather, one might say cynically, what they care about is winning by any means. Now, as a closing point, thinking about whether Trump supporters are serious in their claims about fraud took me to a weird place, namely, no, not New Jersey, but pro wrestling. When I've engaged Trump supporters seriously, and I've tried to do this, again, because I work on an assumption of that they are telling the truth and that they are morally sincere. So I'm engaging them seriously, exactly how I would engage, again, a colleague in my profession. I take the claims seriously and give the claims the respect that they deserve, which involves taking them seriously and assessing them. Now, as you might imagine, the usual response that I get tends to be just insults and fallacies. It feels sometimes as if we're engaged, or they're trying to engage me in some sort of competitive game, rather than looking seriously at important claims about fraud. My hypothesis, which I've totally stolen, is that they might be engaged in a form of kayfabe. I believe I'm pronouncing that horribly incorrectly. A concept from pro wrestling. That is, that they know they're engaged in performative fiction. And accusing Biden of cheating is just part of that theater. It's just what you do when you're doing politics. You just like in sports, you accuse the other fans of being terrible people. You accuse the other team of being awful, even though, of course, there's nothing really to that. So asking them for evidence of cheating, saying, hey, where's this evidence that Joe Biden is cheating, is like asking for evidence that the wrestling heel, the bad guy, really does all those terrible things. Asking that question totally misses the point of the performance. Think of like a wrestling heel. I remember way back, they'd often have Soviet wrestlers, and they'd say like how they're trying to, create class warfare, or, do this and that. And it's just some guy, probably from New Jersey, who's wrestling. He doesn't do any of that stuff. He's not a Marxist. And so asking whether, Ivan the Terrible really did all that terrible stuff. Well, no, he didn't. He's just acting. It's just part of the performance. So if this is the case, then to Trump supporters, I must seem like some idiot who wanders onto stage at a play and thinks the drama is real. So it's like a play about a murder, that I'm taking the murder seriously, and everyone's like, what's this dum-dum doing? He thinks this murder is real. No, we're just acting. So to be honest, I don't know. I mean, are they being serious? In which case I'm trying to engage them seriously, or is it just political theater and I'm just too stupid to realize that it's just theater, and I'm taking this fiction seriously? Again, to be honest, I don't know. Now, in the case of wrestling, taking the make-believe as real has no meaningful consequences. In the case of election and politics in general, the make-believe, if it is such, does seem to have consequences. Elections do seem to be serious matters. And if all this, talk about voter fraud and cheating is just theater, they don't really believe it, they're just saying it, it's harmful theater. So my dilemma is this. If I take Trump supporters seriously, then I do expect evidence for their claims. Just like, again, if I'm gauging, a colleague and we're debating about like the ethics of, targeted assassination, I take their claim seriously and I expect them to argue for it, that we're engaged in a serious discussion and we're going to try to, resolve the matter rationally. So if they're serious, I expect the same thing. We're going to engage on this issue and we're going to find the truth about voter fraud. And I'm willing to go where the evidence takes us. If there is proof that Joe Biden committed, voter fraud on a significant scale, the Democrats, then he would have won the election illegitimately, which is to say he wouldn't have won. But we need evidence. Now, if it's all just, kayfabe, then it makes sense why no evidence is offered. There is no evidence. It's just theater. They're just saying Joe Biden cheated, just like saying Ivan the Terrible, wants to engage in class warfare, and, he, did all these terrible, terrible things, committed all these Marxist crimes. But of course, if it's just, kayfabe, which again I'm horribly mispronouncing, that means their claims can just be dismissed for what they are. It's just mere fiction. They're just shouting nonsense, in a game. So, again, I'm not sure what it is. I'm working from the assumption that it is serious, so I'm engaging seriously. In that case, I expect, evidence, and I'm willing to follow the evidence. But if it's just theater, then, to be honest, and it's just not even worth considering. That's not a game we should be playing with something this important. So, stay safe, and hopefully I'll see you in the future.